This week we're using the quality data, so again, it's saved on the course website, toro.csudh.edu slash the course numbers slash the section and the thing. As usual, it's quality.dta for quality indicators. So we're doing the chapter of the book where they're developing quality indicators for a hospital, right? These are measures of quality of care. Here we have them for different diagnoses, and in this case, we'll compare mortality rates, right? Death rates or death percents, mortality percents for different procedures for a hospital to a national average. So you keep seeing the number 200. We're looking at a hospital with 200 beds. You have some mortality rate. In this first instance, it's 25%. You could see 0.25 compared to a national average of 20.2%, 0.202. Again, so we start with opening the data again. It's on the Toro site. I saved it as quality.dta. You can see the course number and the code for the section and the semester there, and then quality.dta. Remember that Stata files are always .dta files. Common Clear just throws out whatever was in memory before. List the data. So then it's going to show you the diagnoses, and for each diagnosis, the number of hospital beds or patients, the proportion that died, and the proportion that we're comparing it to as a national average. So for the first diagnosis of esophageal cancer, there were 200 beds, 25% died, 0.25 in the hospital, and we're going to compare it to a national average mortality rate or death rate of 0.202 or 20.2%. So it's higher in the hospital than the average because 25% died in the hospital, but 20.2% died on average because 0.25 is higher than 0.202. You can see the p-value there. What's the p-value? It's the middle one, 0.0909. So that's not statistically significant. It's greater than 0.05, so it's above that cutoff. It's not significant. So mortality rate was higher in the hospital because 0.25 is greater than 0.202, but it's not statistically significant because that p-value was 0.0909, which is higher than 0.05. If you graph it, see again, remember higher than the average, so I drew the average at 0.202, that's the red line going across. And then the height of the blue bar, that's 0.25, what it is for the hospital. So is it above or below the national average, higher or lower? You can see from the graph, higher or lower than the red line. You can see from the data, 0.25 higher than 0.202. And then is it statistically significant, which we could see from those p-value tests. So I showed you an example of one graph. Now I included the code for all the graphs. So let's make a new data dashboard comparing the hospital's mortality rate for each diagnosis to the national average. So for esophageal, the bars above the red line, that's bad. That means there's a higher mortality rate in the hospital. Mortality's bad. Hip, we see it's about comparable to national average. Abdominal, the hospital's doing worse. Again, it was higher. Run through the data again. There's the data again. So for each one, you can see the proportion that died in the hospital and the proportion that died on average, whether it's greater than average or less than average, higher than average or lower than average. You can see the p-value there on the bottom center, 0.0909, right in the middle. Higher than that cutoff of 0.05, not statistically significant. So higher than average, 0.25 is greater than 0.202. Not statistically significant, 0.09 is greater than 0.05. The p-value is always comparing it to 0.05. P-values less than 0.05 are statistically significant. P-values greater than 0.05 are not statistically significant. If you highlight everything and press that do button, the play button in the top right, let everything run, make a graph of each of them, put them in the data dashboard. So if it's above the red line, that's bad. That means the hospital is doing worse than average, more deaths than average for that diagnosis. If it's at the same height as the red line, it's about average. And if it's lower than the red line, like pneumonia is better than the hospital average. Lower mortality rate in this hospital for pneumonia compared to the national average. So given the number of beds in the hospital, 200, the mortality rate in the hospital for esophageal 0.25, and the mortality rate overall for esophageal 0.202, we can calculate whether or not it was higher or lower than the national average and whether or not it was statistically significant.